They froze our gold, but they will never freeze our dignity. This is not debt, it is control, and we will not bow. In the spring of 2025, news broke that a shipment of gold worth $300 million from Burkina Faso had been frozen at a European port. For many people, the story sounded like just another complicated financial dispute, something far away from daily life. But for Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation in West Africa, this was not just another piece of economic news. It was a thunderclap. The nation's most valuable resource, gold, had been taken out of its reach, and with it, the country's hopes of funding schools, hospitals, clean water systems, and food security projects seemed to vanish overnight. Gold is not a luxury item in Burkina Faso. It is the lifeblood of the economy. More than 3/4 of the country's exports come from gold. The revenue from gold sales is what helps the government pay salaries, import food, and invest in development. When that $300 million shipment was stopped, it was like someone closing the main pipeline of oxygen to a struggling patient. And yet, what made it even more shocking was the reason. There was no lawsuit, no trade dispute, no missing documents. Instead, it was politics. Reports suggested that behind the decision were calls from Washington and even a direct push from President Donald Trump, who reportedly made it clear if Africa wanted to stay in the game of global trade and finance, it had to follow the rules set by the West. For ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso, most of whom live on less than $2,000 a year, the news was enraging. Imagine working in the blistering heat, digging gold out of the earth, only to be told that when it is shipped abroad, it no longer belongs to you. Farmers, miners, teachers, and families heard the story on the radio and felt robbed. They had already lived with the daily reality of poverty. Schools without chalk, clinics without medicine, children walking miles to fetch dirty water. Now to learn that their country's gold was stuck in a European vault felt like an open insult. The anger in Ouagadougou, the capital, spread quickly. Crowds gathered in the streets holding placards that read, "They steal in daylight and call it law." For the people, it was not just about money. Now in the 21st century, the tools are different, but the pattern looks the same. This is why the seizure triggered not just frustration, but a wave of defiance. People were not simply angry about losing money. They were angry about being treated as though they had no right to decide their own future. The $300 million shipment became a symbol for something much larger, the battle between sovereignty and subjugation. The people of Burkina Faso asked, if they can take our gold today, what will they take tomorrow? From this single event, a much bigger conversation began across the Sahel and beyond. Was this the time when Africa should finally stop outsourcing its future? Could this be the moment to build its own systems of finance, its own reserves, and its own paths to trade? Or would the chains of dependency tighten once again, forcing the continent to bow to the same old rules? In the end, the seizure of $300 million in gold was not just an economic crisis. It was a test of identity. It forced Burkina Faso and much of Africa to confront a painful truth that wealth means little if you do not control it. What happens to gold in vaults thousands of miles away is not just about markets. It is about who holds power, who makes decisions, and who gets to shape the future. For Burkina Faso, the fight over that one shipment became the spark of a bigger struggle. A struggle not for money, but for the right to stand tall as a sovereign nation. The frozen gold quickly took on a meaning much larger than money. To the people of Burkina Faso, it became a symbol of dignity and sovereignty. Gold dug from their land by miners working under scorching heat was supposed to serve their children and communities. Instead, it was blocked abroad. This felt like a direct attack on their independence. On the streets, citizens expressed this symbolism creatively. Young people painted stones gold and carried them during marches, showing that the wealth beneath their soil belonged at home. Mothers held signs saying, "Debt is not destiny." Veterans raised national flags, reminding everyone of the sacrifices made for freedom. The message was simple. Independence without control of resources is just an illusion. Western media called the demonstrations instability, but the reality was different. Families walked peacefully together. Students, farmers, and shopkeepers all joined the cause. What outsiders labeled chaos, locals called unity. For the first time, ordinary people felt connected to the bigger question of who controls Africa's wealth. Traore's words strengthened this symbolism. Instead of speaking about contracts or IMF terms, he spoke about power and control. His declaration resonated deeply because it connected the seizure to Africa's long history of exploitation. During colonial times, resources were taken without consent. Now, in modern times, it seemed the same pattern continued only through financial systems instead of ships. The symbolism spread beyond borders. Activists in Mali, Niger, and Senegal began sharing images online. The frozen gold was no longer just Burkina Faso's problem. It became Africa's symbol of struggle. It reminded the continent that dignity cannot be imported and sovereignty must be defended. When news broke that Burkina Faso's gold worth $300 million had been frozen at a European port, the reaction on the streets was immediate and explosive. Within hours, thousands of people poured into the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital. These were not just activists or politicians. They were miners with calloused hands, students still in their school uniforms, mothers carrying babies, and farmers with dust still clinging to their clothes. Together, they raised one chant that echoed like thunder. Our gold is not collateral for the IMF. What made these protests so powerful was their diversity. Poor laborers stood shoulder to shoulder with young entrepreneurs. University graduates shouted statistics about Africa paying more than $30 billion in interest every year, while mothers spoke about hospitals without medicine. Children painted small stones gold and carried them as a reminder that the wealth beneath their soil was real, not just numbers on a screen. Every voice added to the same cry. Africa's resources should belong to Africans. Western media quickly rushed to frame the demonstrations as instability in the Sahel. Headlines in Paris and London spoke of chaos and disorder, but on the ground, the reality was different. Families marched peacefully side by side. Elders carried national flags as symbols of history and unity. The protests were not riots of despair. They were movements of conviction. For many, this was the first time they felt they had a chance to directly challenge a system that had drained their country for generations. The symbolism of the protests was undeniable. Placards read, "Debt is not destiny, and gold is for schools, not banks." For ordinary citizens, the gold seizure was not just about one shipment. It was about centuries of exploitation where Africa's wealth was taken away while its people were left in poverty. By flooding the streets, the people were saying enough. The outcry spread quickly beyond Burkina Faso. Activists in Mali, Niger, and even Senegal began sharing images and slogans online. What began as a national protest started to feel like a regional awakening. For the first time, ordinary citizens across borders were united by a common cause, the demand for sovereignty over their own resources. In the end, the public outcry proved one thing clearly. This was not just a fight between governments and financial institutions. It was a fight of ordinary people defending their dignity. And once the people speak in one voice, no global power can easily silence them. The frozen gold also forced many to look closely at the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and its rules. For decades, African nations have relied on IMF loans to keep their economies afloat, but those loans come with conditions: cut subsidies, privatize services, and repay in US dollars at interest rates often between 7 and 9%. Meanwhile, wealthy Western nations borrow at less than 2%. For Burkina Faso, this system felt like a trap. The gold seizure looked like a way to enforce these rules. It was as if the message was play by IMF conditions or your wealth will be held hostage. To ordinary people, this was not partnership, it was exploitation. Captain Traore pointed out that many of these debts were not even signed by today's citizens. They were imposed by regimes long gone, yet new generations were still paying for them. In his eyes, accepting the IMF's terms meant admitting Burkina Faso's future was not in its own hands. This framing turned the IMF from a financial institution into a symbol of neo-colonialism, colonial control, wearing modern clothes. The gold seizure became the latest reminder that loans and aid often come at the cost of sovereignty. For Africa, the question grew louder. Should development depend on debt, or should it be built on the wealth already in its soil? The IMF's rules promised stability, but at the cost of dignity, and for many Africans, that price was now too high. Captain Ibrahim-Traoré's response to the crisis became a defining moment. Instead of bowing to international pressure, he spoke boldly. "This is not debt, this is control." With those words, he stripped away the legal language surrounding the frozen gold and revealed the heart of the issue. For Traore, accepting IMF terms or foreign dictates was not just about economics. It was about surrendering the right of his people to chart their own destiny. He reminded his ministers that many of the debts Africa carried were never chosen by the people. Why then should gold mined by poor farmers and miners be used to pay for them? His defiance was not reckless. It was calculated. He believed Africa's future depended on breaking free from dependency. By aligning with BRICS partners, exploring alternatives to the US dollar, and pushing for regional cooperation, he signaled that Burkina Faso would not play by old rules. His words resonated deeply with ordinary citizens. Farmers, miners, and students repeated his phrases in markets and classrooms. In their eyes, Traore was not just a president. He was a voice of resistance. His defiance transformed anger into policy, turning frustration into a vision for sovereignty. But his stance also came with risks, sanctions, trade blockades, and political pressure. The question was whether Burkina Faso could withstand these storms while holding on to its independence. Traore's gamble was clear. Better to struggle with dignity than to survive in chains. The crisis soon spread beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In an emergency session, the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger declared solidarity. "Your gold is our fight too," they told Traore. What began as one nation struggle became a regional cause. The idea was bold. Build a joint African gold reserve stored not in Paris or London, but on African soil. This would be a shield against dependency and a foundation for future credit that did not rely on IMF rules. For citizens, the reserve was more than economics. It was a symbol of unity and sovereignty. Ordinary people supported the plan in remarkable ways. Farmers offered grain to feed soldiers guarding construction sites. Miners volunteered to help dig vaults. Street vendors even donated small sums of money, some as little as $10 to show ownership. It was not just a government project. It was a people's project. The vision was clear. Africa's wealth should not be collateral for loans abroad. It should be the backbone of Africa's future. The AES alliance showed that when nations unite, their voice grows louder and their sovereignty stronger.